This week on AgriView, we have four important themes that I think we must reflect on. I always say that South Africa is an export-oriented agricultural sector, which is why I was so excited when I saw the news coming out of China saying they may be lowering the import tariff for a range of products coming from the African continent. And of course, as the agricultural sector, we always ask ourselves, how can we deepen trade with China? And I think there is room now to have that conversation and even look at what can be realistic. And of course, in the coming months, many BRICS countries will be traveling to Brazil for the BRICS annual conference. And agribusiness is one of the themes that will be discussed there. And trade must be on the table in those conversations. And of course, we can't always talk about trade and growing agricultural sector without reflecting on the importance of biosecurity. We've talked a lot about the importance of animal health, but plant health is part of those conversations that we must have. And this involves the investments as well as what South Africa can do in addition to the efforts that we have already made. And I think we cannot close this week without actually reflecting on the good news that we have been observing for the first 5 months of this year, which is that the South African farmers are spending more and more on machinery, tractors, combined harvester sale. That is all the themes that we will be discussing in this week's segment. The South African agricultural sector, in all of the growth that we have seen over the past couple of decades, have leaned on a number of things. It is investment on productivity at a farm level, but also the progress that we have made on the export side. And I think if you look at our basket of export now, which on a year is just under 14 billion US dollars, you will see that we are quite diverse in a number of regions. The African continent, almost half of the exports go there, but also other regions have a fair number of representation of where our agricultural exports go. But there is one country that everyone, wherever you go, always mention is China. And South Africa at this moment, we still have room to grow our agricultural sector at a farm level. The numbers that we have when we look at the area that we can still farm, we all think that this sector can still add plus 30% in terms of the gross value added. Of course, then we have to continuously ask the question of saying, if we expand the production, where will those products go to? And China is one of those important markets. In the past, there's been some trouble with China because if you look at how China has been doing in the world, they remain the most important agricultural importer. Last year, they were the second biggest. They account for roughly 11% of global agricultural imports. That is over 200 billion US dollars. Remember, as South Africa, we export only just under 14 billion US dollars. But if you look at how much have we been exporting to China, we remain a small market in China. I'm looking at the figures now. We are about 0.4% in the Chinese imports. The number of countries that have dominated China are Latin American countries, South America, the US, and many others that export there, but not a lot from the African continent. You may ask then a question to say, why haven't we been exporting more in China? Aren't we friendly with China? We are exporting to China. I mean, that 0.4% is just around 900 million US dollars that we send. It's still largely wool, a bit of red meat and wine, but there are some tariffs that are in China. Think about our wine again. If you send our wine in China, we face tariffs of around about 14%. For some that is bottled, there are even higher tariffs that we face. But if you compare with our competitors, the likes of Australia, they are actually accessing the Chinese market at zero tariffs. The only difference that it makes then is the fact that they have a trade agreement with China and we don't have a preferential trade agreement in terms of agriculture with China. And this has been causing us a bit of complications. Now, you may look into these products and say, what is it then? It's the tariffs and what? The phytosanitary barriers is also one of the things that have been blocking there. If we can loosen up the phyto barriers that we are experiencing, we can be able to access the Chinese market. I'm giving you this background because this past week, there were excellent news coming out of China. They signaled that they will lower the tariffs for a range of products from the African continent entering the Chinese market. And of course, as the agricultural sector, we are looking into this to say, okay, maybe this is a time and a place where at least we can finally see our agricultural exports growing into China. And of course, this will mean the expansion of the red meat exports, the expansion of grain exports, and a whole range of fruits that we are looking at expanding and exporting more to China. The population, the buying power are some of the things that are exciting within that Chinese market. And in fact, if you were to look at the South African agricultural export strategy, we talk about retaining the markets that we already have, which means that the roughly 20% share in our exports that the EU region constitutes, as well as the nearly half of the exports to the African continent, part of the Middle East and some Asian countries, we want to retain that. But in addition to it, we are thinking about how do we expand our exports. And China is one of those exciting markets that we are looking at expanding to. And now I think these news that are coming out of the Chinese leadership, they dovetail fairly well with our strategy about how do we expand the exports as South Africa. But the conversation doesn't end there, because in the coming months, trade ministers and the political leadership from all of the BRICS countries will be heading to Brazil for the annual BRICS summit. And in that BRICS summit, there's a number of things that gets to be discussed, the political, various sectoral stuff, but agriculture, agribusiness is always one of the themes that is on the table. Those of you that have followed this conversation for some time, you'll recall that when we had the BRICS summit in Johannesburg in 2023, one of the points that South Africa put on the table was the issue of deepening agricultural trade within the BRICS countries. At that time, we were still a fairly small grouping, only the original members of BRICS. And if you were to look at our agricultural imports at that time, we were just around $300 billion. That's combined now. And of course, China and India were taking a bigger share of that. Right now, the BRICS grouping has expanded. There's new members. If you look at it now, a point you can make it looking at the data and say, look, the BRICS countries make up roughly half of global agricultural trade. But the difficulty with it is that the intra-BRICS trade remain fairly low. And the key issues come back to the same thing that I was talking about with China, which is the higher tariffs as well as the phytosanitary barriers that we experience in these markets, either related to how some handle animal products, handle plant products. That's the phyto issues that I'm talking about, as well as this conversation about the tariffs. And I think that in the conversations that will happen in Brazil in the coming months, this is one of the themes that must be on the table to say, how do we encourage intra-BRICS trade by lowering all of these barriers so that the agricultural trade amongst these countries can pretty much take off? You could almost think about this in a theme of saying, achieving food security through trade. Because trade and making sure that food products can be available in a number or accessible in a number of BRICS countries in a fastest and the most efficient way, that lowers the cost. And I think that is at the benefit of the BRICS countries, as well as generally when we are thinking about global food security. Those are the discussions that will be happening. And I think as South Africa, we take great interest in here because India, in addition to China, Saudi Arabia also, those are some of the countries we are hoping to deepen agricultural exports, in addition, of course, to retaining the markets that we already have. But we can't always talk about the issue of expanding the agricultural exports without paying attention on an emerging risk. These are the risks around animal health as well as plant health. In the previous segments of this conversation, we've been talking a lot about the foot and mouth disease that South Africa is experiencing. And as South Africa, by the way, we are not alone here. A number of our BRICS friends have suffered from these diseases. I mean, think back a couple of years, China struggled with their African swine fever in their pig industry, and that was devastating for the Chinese farming sector, as well as generally in terms of food price inflation in the country. Right now, our friends in Brazil are struggling with the avian influenza, which is also a big issue there because Brazil is an important player, not only just as an exporter to South Africa, but to the world in terms of their poultry products. So the conversation about biosecurity is something that can be had also at a level of BRICS to say, how do we promote animal health as well as plant health within this conversation? And how do we share technology and insights and thinking about encouraging investments and loosen up regulations where it's necessary around these aspects? But I think as South Africa, as a country where we pride ourselves by growing exports, retaining markets we have, accessing new areas, we ought to invest more in plant health as well as in animal health. This involves both the private sector as well as the government playing its part on allocating the financing, making sure also that there's greater collaboration in this aspect of biosecurity in the country. Because I'll tell you what, with all of the progress that we typically boast about, to say, hey, since 1994, the South African agricultural sector has more than doubled in value and in volume terms. If you look at it, to the point that I mentioned earlier of saying we have invested more on productivity, it all has to do with also about strong biosecurity capabilities that we have had on surveillance, controlling the diseases, spotting them from the onset, and making sure that we have the vaccines and some of the agrochemicals that are needed to deal with these challenges. But over the recent past, we've lost capacity on that. You know about the OBP and the other institutions that lost capacity, issues of corruption, issues of the human capital, and we need to revive that, revive it in collaboration with the private sector. Because that is our strength as South Africa when we are thinking about participating in a global space. I mean, today, we are the only African country that is in the top 40 global agricultural exporters, ranked at number 32. We want to see that improving and more African countries joining the list of the exporters as they improve their domestic agricultural production. And that will involve some level of investments around these aspects. Talking about investments is also why I'm so happy to see that we not only need investment on a biosecurity, but also on a mechanical side. The farmers in South Africa have been doing quite a lot. I mean, I'm looking now in the papers that are in front of me on the tractors and combine harvester sales for the first 5 months in South Africa. They've been on the positive. Farmers spending more, buying more tractors and buying more combine harvesters. What this tells us is that there is still strong confidence about where this sector is going, and the farmers are spending money so that they can be able to expand and ensure that their enterprises operate as efficiently as they've been over the past few years, and even increase from the levels that they are in. And of course, we are coming from a year where the tractor sales weren't as robust, and there are clear decisions on why, or clear reasons on why the tractor sales were not as robust. For example, take 2024. Because the years before that, the farmers had a lot of money from the better harvest. And in fact, I must not generalize and say all the farmers, because now I'll see you guys coming in and say, Wandile, you said the farmers have a lot of money. Where's this money? But they have made better returns because of the better harvest that they got in the past 3 seasons, 2021, 22, and 2023. And at the time, the commodity prices were also high, particularly for the grains and the oilseeds farmers. And they used those returns to actually invest in the farms and buy more machinery, which is why in 2024, you saw that the replacement rate of a machinery was actually low. Now in 2025, they're coming back to the market and getting some of the new technologies that they need, which is why the tractor sales have been so robust since the start of the year. But let's face it, there's also a better agricultural season. I mean, if you're looking at it now, at our grains and the oilseeds harvest, it's up 16% on a year-on-year basis. We're expecting overall a harvest that is just under 18 million tons. That is in support of the sales that we are seeing. But the fact that also the interest rates have been fairly low or are continuing to soften, that also helps a little bit for the farmers to continue to invest in the sector. The sentiment also has been generally been positive. These are all the constructive things about the agricultural sector. And I think if you look at that amount of money that is being invested and you look at where the possibilities of expansion are, it is only right that we continue to invest on plant health as well as on animal health, and we strengthen those capabilities of South Africa so that when we talk about the exports entering China and the other countries, we are able to do so. Because if we don't invest on biosecurity, then we can kiss and goodbye on the export markets. I mean, we all know that when we have had outbreaks, we get temporarily blocked in a number of export markets, but we also don't want to be a country that always writes about outbreaks of diseases. It creates this perception that there are a number of risks that are in South Africa, which is why this issue is so important. And yes, we're closing on positive news. China may be lowering tariffs. The key question then is about how do we engage them productively so that we grow the South African agricultural exports that go to China as well as within the other BRICS countries. Those are important themes, folks, that I think give us all hope that there is room for growth and prosperity in South Africa's agricultural sector. Thanks for listening, and do subscribe to our channel and spread the word.